My guest today is Don Bentley. Don is the author of the Matt Drake series, as well as the New York Times best-selling Jack Ryan Jr. series for Tom Clancy, and he's now at the helm of Vince Flynn's Mitch Rapp series. So let's welcome Don Bentley. This is the Course of Action podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, Good Pods, and the Reeves Across America radio network. Watch every episode live on YouTube and check out the blog post on jeffclarkofficial.com. All right, everyone, welcome back. I got Don Bentley with me today. Don, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for doing this again. And we had some internet issues going on last time, and my mic didn't work. It just wasn't meant to be. But we're going to get it in real quick before I hit the airport to go to BoucherCon. And you are getting ready to be very busy with the book tour and the release of Capture or Kill, and we're super pumped about that. I know the whole Mitch Rapp fan base is pumped to see what you're going to do. I got to read it early. I loved it. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
But let's talk about the book tour a little bit. You're
Sure.
kicking that off in Minneapolis, right?
Yeah. So that's a really cool story. When John Grisham and Tom Clancy, Vince Flynn's first book, Term Limits, did not immediately grab the attention of the New York publishing industry, and so he sold it out of the back of his car, and one of the bookstores he rolled up in was in Minneapolis. It's called Once Upon a Crime, and so Vince is from that area, and he walked in and he said, "Please stock my book," and the owner said, "Nah, I don't think so," and Vince said, "I'm going to make it big, and when I make it big, I'll launch every book tour out of this store," and so I'm sure the owner had probably heard that a time or two, but with Vince, it came to fruition, and now we do the start of everyone out of that store, and it's just fantastic. I did it for the first time last year with Kyle, and you walk in, and it's standing room only. Everybody's wearing their Mitch Rapp shirts and gear, and people had traveled from as far away as Georgia and Nebraska and all over the place, so it is just phenomenal, so I'm really looking forward to that.
And while you're on the book tour, I just saw that you posted something that you're going to do a bourbon tasting with the guys from Four Branches. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so Mike Trott is one of the four. Four Branches is a really cool company in that it was founded by veterans who come from the four branches of the military service. So I guess you could argue there's five now with Space Force, but Mike Trott is one of those guys. He was an Air Force veteran, and so when I did the book launch for my fourth Matt Drake book, Forgotten War, he actually came to Georgetown and brought bourbon with him, and we did a sampling for the audience, and that's what some of those pictures were from, and it was so much fun that we decided to do it this time around, but bigger at Scottsdale. And so Poison Pen is a famous bookstore owned by Barbara, and she's an amazing lady, and said we could do it. And so Four Branches actually appears in Capture or Kill. So there's a scene where there's something in the military, in the Army specifically, where they use a thing called phase lines, which are kind of graphical things on a map to be able to chart, much like the lines on a football field help you keep track of where the ball is. Phase lines help you keep track of, in this case, the aerial reconnaissance that's happening in Afghanistan, and you normally name them for a theme, like 80s rock bands or something like that. And so I used bourbons, and so Four Branches makes an appearance in Capture or Kill.
Well, can't argue with that. Bourbon's a good choice. Of course, I haven't got a chance to try Four Branches yet, but I've been looking out for it. If I get my hands on a bottle, I'm going to definitely try it for sure.
Well, you can come to Scottsdale and get it straight from. They're actually, I think, debuting a new batch in Scottsdale, so I'm pretty excited about that. Yeah.
Okay. Very cool. So let's talk about getting the call to take over for Kyle Mills and what your initial reaction was to that news.
Yeah, so it was it was a pretty long vetting process. I ended up having conversations with Emily Bessler, the fantastic editor for Vince, Kyle, and then other little known authors like Jack Carr and Brad Thor. And then also I had a quite in-depth conversation, maybe more than one, with Vince's agent. It's a guy named Sloan Harris, and he's still the agent for the estate. He's a phenomenal big-time agent, but a really nice guy. And those two are very much the guardians of Vince's legacy in the sense that they have been around from the beginning. They were there all through Kyle's era, and now are there for mine. And so when I found out that I had been selected, I was pretty ecstatic, but it was also kind of a weight because, you know, Vince is my favorite all-time author and many people's favorite all-time author, to the point that when they announced the transition from Kyle to me on social media, David Brown, who's my publicist, texted me and he said, "It's trending right now on social media, on Twitter." And so that was really cool. But the essence of those trending tweets was something to the extent of, "We're super glad that the series is going to continue, but you have very big shoes to fill. Don't mess this up." And so I think that was said sort of in good humor, but, you know, I took that to heart, that this is my favorite all-time author, that this series means a lot to a lot of people, and I'm a fan first, and I wanted to do right by the fans with Capture or Kill.
I remember that day when the news broke, and it was just it was trending. It was the craziest thing, but it shows you the magnitude of the Vince Flynn and the Mitch Rapp fan base and how excited they were at. So it's such a little news. It was bittersweet news, you know, with Kyle exiting and the series going forward, but it was kind of okay, the series is going to kind of not be refreshed, but take on a new trajectory with you behind the pen. What was your mindset behind getting started in the project?
Yeah, so what I wanted to do was to go back and spend a lot of time just immersing myself in the novels that Vince wrote. And not because Kyle's weren't fantastic. They absolutely were. In fact, Kyle could have just written a series of books that were kind of like the continuing adventures of Mitch Rapp and Scott Coleman, and he didn't do that. He made some pretty brave choices that took the series in entirely new and unexpected directions. And as a fan, a reader first, I owe Kyle a great deal of gratitude for that. But I wanted to make sure that I wasn't writing Mitch as a derivative of a derivative in that. And so I went back and just immersed myself in Vince's books and read them over and over and over again, and noticed that the way Vince worked is that every book that came out aged Mitch in real time. And so if he had a book that came out in 2007, for instance, Mitch was however old he was in 2007, and that book referenced, you know, the events that happened in 2007. And so he did that up until he wrote the book. It's not Pursuit of Honor. Is it Pursuit of Honor? I got it on my right now. It is Pursuit of Honor. Yeah, and there's too many P's. So he did that until he wrote Pursuit of Honor. And then he paused the series for 2 books in which he went back and he wrote Mitch's origin story. And so those 2 books are American Assassin and Kill Shot. And then Vince jumped forward in time again and picked the series back up several years later with The Last Man, which was tragically his final book before he passed away from prostate cancer. So when I looked at that, there's a gap in time between Pursuit of Honor and The Last Man, in which things obviously happened to Mitch Rapp, but we as readers didn't know what they were. And so that really intrigued me, because I thought, you know, if I could go back and write in that time period, it's kind of like I'm writing with training wheels, because I've got Vince's books on either side of this one. I'm writing in an era where it was only Vince, and I might get to use some characters that in the current series, the last of those being Code Red, have since gone to their just or perhaps unjust rewards. And so all of that really appealed to me. And when I started looking at what physical years were encompassed by those, one was 2011. And so Capture or Kill is really the answer to the question that Vince Flynn fans have been asking for the last 13 years. And that question is, what role did Mitch Rapp play in the mission to capture or kill Osama bin Laden?
When you settled on that idea and started moving forward with the manuscript, um, what did you think about putting Mitch Rapp in with such a historic event in military history? We both served. Were you still active at that time?
No, I was an FBI agent at that time.
Okay,
Yeah,
still
I was.
still serving.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was really interesting because when I had the idea, I then had to pitch it to two people. I had to pitch it to Emily Bessler and to Sloan Harris. And so with Emily, I had a Zoom call, and I can't recall if we had ever met in person. We might have once, but it was briefly. So I really didn't know her, and other than by reputation, and she has an amazing reputation. And
Yes.
so I was pretty nervous pitching the book to her, and we were doing it over Zoom, and she was working from home that day, and I think she was in her kitchen, and so I could see her. She was listening to me, but she was kind of walking back and forth and doing things, and in my head I thought, she hates this idea. Like, she's just getting ready. She's waiting for me to finish talking, and then she's going to say, not only do I not like that idea, but we chose the wrong writer completely for this series. You're fired. And so she didn't do that. She finished, when I finished talking, she stopped. She looked down for a minute, and then she looked in the camera, and she's like, I love it. You should write it. And I'm like, oh, that's awesome. And so I came up on that high and then had a call with Sloan Harris, and Sloan listened. And then when I got to the end of the pitch, he said, so let me understand this. Are you saying that Mitch is going to be the number 2 man in the stack right behind Rob O'Neill? Is that what's going to happen? And I'm like, no, of course that's what not going to. And I didn't have any idea what was going to happen because I don't know how I'm going to write the book until I start writing it. But Sloan gave his approval to his credit. And so what I started to do is looking to see if Vince had ever addressed it, if he had ever addressed the Bin Laden raid or said anything about it. And so there's a section on his website on vinceflynn.com where there are questions that readers have written into him, and he answers them. And so I found one on the Bin Laden raid specifically where somebody asked, what was Mitch Rapp doing during the Bin Laden raid? And Vince gave kind of a generic answer. He said something along the lines of, I'm sure there were many stories we don't know about that would detail the actions that different CIA operatives took in order to set the conditions for that raid. And so that's what started getting me thinking, is that you can't, the Bin Laden raid is obviously a significant and a real historical event, and it wouldn't be right to insert Mitch in the middle of that. But what would he have done, knowing his character and the role that Vince created in that universe? And the book kind of came together from there.
What does it mean to you to put out a book in this series from a guy who meant so much to you?
Yeah, so I wrote 3 books that didn't sell before I wrote Without Sanction that did, and that kind of launched my career. And so over the course of those 3 years, it took me about 17 years to get through those 3, because I wrote them much too slowly, and then when they didn't sell, I tried to keep coming back with them for way too long. And then, I lost my mojo during some of it, trying to figure out if I could even be a writer. And so during one of those dark times, I think it was after my second book didn't sell, I actually took my favorite Vince Flynn book, which is Protect and Defend, and which things from Protect and Defend feature pretty heavily in Capture or Kill, because it was my favorite book, and there were so many loose threads I thought would be fun to pull. And so I took that book in a stack of colored note cards, and I used a separate note card for every scene and a different color note card for every character. And then I broke that into the 3-act structure. And we lived in a little house at that time, and I didn't have an office. And so I taped it to my bedroom wall, which my wife was less than thrilled about. But for me, like, seeing it all up in the wall like that was kind of like the difference between looking at a building and looking at the blueprints of a building. And so for the first time, I could see how many scenes does Vince go before he brings Mitch Rapp in. And then I would take like a little asterisk or make a star on every note card that represented a fight scene or a conflict. And so it was very interesting to be able to pull back the curtain and see how a master of the genre approached his craft. And so he, like I said, Vince was very, very instrumental, or influential rather, to my writing. I think all of us who write in this genre, who came on the scene post 9/11, draw something from what Vince did, because he was the first post 9/11 military espionage thriller writer to come up with the idea of this character whose job it is to track, to hunt his nation's enemies on their own turf and shoot them in the face. And so both from a writer perspective, a fan perspective, and then the genre perspective, he was a huge influence in my life. And I never got to meet him. And so it's hard for me to picture him as a person. And so something I started doing, I think, because the people who did work closely with him, Emily and Sloan and David Brown, genuinely love him and as a person. And so every time I would talk with one of them, I'd seem to get kind of a Vince story at the end. So then I just started asking for him. And at the end of every call or something, I'm like, hey, can you tell me another Vince story? And I got to meet his widow, Lisa, and her new husband and go to dinner with them and Kyle. It was amazing. And just kind of understand who he was as a person. And that helped me somewhat understand his series better. But I think that also added its own weight to me, because now he wasn't just a faceless guy, or not a faceless guy, but someone I had no connection to, like when I wrote the Clancy books.
Sure.
Now he was becoming a person to me, and it was more, I felt more pressure to do well by this. And so it was something I certainly wrestled with throughout the book. And when I got to the end of it in the dedication, I asked Lisa if I could dedicate it to Vince, because I really am grateful to him as a writer, as a fan, on so many levels for giving the world Mitch Rapp, and she gave her okay for that. And so that's who the book is dedicated for, because I really do hope this book makes him proud.
What would you say to aspiring writers who want to be in your shoes? Somebody who has their own series, who got to write in the Tom Clancy series, who we all look up to big time. And then, of course, Vince Flynn, the first post 9/11 big time thriller author. What would you say to aspiring authors giving your resume?
Yeah, so I get to teach at the MFA program now that I got mine from, and it's called Seton Hill University. It's a great little school, about an hour east of Pittsburgh, and it's a low residency MFA program, meaning you only go up there twice a year, and your thesis project is your novel. And so every time I teach a class or talk about writing, I say you have to, in order to be a good writer, you have to read a lot and you have to write a lot. And the read a lot needs to be in the genre that you're trying to write. And so, for instance, if you tell me you're trying to write a military thriller, my first question to you, or even if you tell me you want to write crime fiction or fantasy or whatever, the question I ask every one of my students is, what are the 3 books that are current bestsellers that your book should be shelved next to? And if you can't rattle that off, you don't know enough about your genre. And the reason why that's important is because you, at the end of the day, if you're writing commercial fiction, you're making a product for a specific audience, and that audience has expectations. So I love fantasy novels. Jim Butcher is one of my favorite urban fantasy writers. But when I pick up a Jim Butcher book, a urban fantasy book, I have different expectations than I do when I pick up a Brad Taylor book, who is also one of my favorite writers, but writes in a completely different genre. And so you, as the writer, need to know what your book would be shelved next to, because you have to understand the things that you are going to keep the same and the things that you are going to be different, you are going to do differently in your writing than what those authors do. So I love Brad Taylor, but I am never going to be able to write a better Brad Taylor book than Brad can. So when I wrote Without Sanction, I made some very conscious choices in the way I told the story, my protagonists, things like that, that were different from Vince Flynn or Brad Thor or Brad Taylor or Mark Greaney. If you haven't done that research, you will not be successful in writing in that genre. And the second piece is you have to write a lot. And so Stephen King in his book on writing famously calls writing more of a blue collar job. And what he means by that is if you are waiting for inspiration to write, you probably won't be very successful. You have to sit down and write every single day or almost every single day. But kind of where the magic happens is that when you do that regularly, your story will live in your subconscious, and you'll be at the gym doing deadlifts and you'll have this flash of insight about something you're wrestling about in your work. And so those two things go together. And when I have a person come up to me and say, here's my passion project, I want to write a fantasy novel about X, Y, or Z. And I say, great, who are your influences? And they can't name that. I'm like, you're not going to be a successful writer if you're not first an avid reader.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's fantastic advice, and that's something I've always told myself is be a student. I looked at Brad Thor, I looked at Jack Carr, the Vince Flynn books, the old Clancy books, the new Clancy books, your books,
Yep.
a lot of different folks, and just studied the way you did the pacing, the way you transitioned, is it first person, is it third person, what is it? And just look at that, because you can learn so much from just reading.
Yeah, and it can be very practical. When one of my books didn't sell, like I said, I had a lot of books that didn't sell. This was back in the days where there were these things called malls, and within the malls there were bookstores. And I was walking through the mall with my buddy who was also a writer, and he said, all right, let's go in the bookstore, and you point to me 3 books that your book should be shelved next to. And so I did, and we grabbed them off the shelf, and we read the first chapter of each of those 3 books. And in that first chapter of each of those 3 books, either somebody had been died, there was a gunfight, or at least there was a gun referenced. And so he looked at me and he said, does your book have that in the first chapter? And it didn't. And that's not to say that you need to be derivative, but you have to understand what readers' expectations were, because if someone had read my book, they probably would not have said, hey, I expected somebody to die in the first chapter and nobody died, but they might use words like, it just seemed a little slow to me, or the pacing was off, because they have been subconsciously conditioned to expect certain things when they read a book in this genre. And again, if you don't understand those things and know them yourself as a writer, you are not going to make instinctively the correct choices you need to when you're writing your own book.
And the market is so tough today. It seems like, some of the things I've been told is like the market's tough. You got to write something to the market. You're going to be writing a lot. You're going to get told no a lot, but be creative and find things to write about, and constantly just keep churning out ideas, because that's your IP at the end of the day. Whether it sells or not, that's still yours. But you have to be a student. You have to understand the market as best as you can, with insider info, and that's how you have to press forward.
Yeah, there's the kind of conundrum with writing is that if you do not ever take feedback, you will never get any better as a writer. But at the same time, if you take the wrong feedback, you will also not get any better in a writer. And so Greg Hurwitz has this fantastic reel on his Facebook page where he talks about accepting criticism and how to understand when to accept criticism. And so when I teach my MFA classes and we do workshop critiques, I start each workshop by playing that video, because I felt like when I went through the MFA program, I lost my mojo for a little bit, because I got so much feedback by so many different people that if you accept all of that, you lose what makes your writing unique in your voice. But if you accept none of them, then why are you even at the program, right? You're not going to get any better. And so Greg has a fantastic take on that, and I'm going to paraphrase it. He's in addition to Orphan X series and everything he's written, he's also a very eloquent speaker, and so I'm probably going to butcher what he said, but it's something to the effect of, you need to find the person who has your best interests at heart, and when you get their feedback, you feel it and you're like, yep, I was lazy there. Yep, I didn't do my job as a writer. Yep. But they're not trying to turn your work into their work, or to, just tear you down for that sake. And once you find that person or two, you should hold on to them and not bring other people into the conversation that dilute that. And so a lot of times, even when my when I'm talking to my students, I have 2 students that I'm their advisor. I'm like, look, at the end of the day, if you get feedback that's different than my feedback, you need to take my feedback. And it's not because I'm amazing and your critique partners aren't necessarily. It's because I've seen your entire novel. And so I understand what you're trying to do in a way that somebody's only seen 20 pages of that submission doesn't. And so
Yeah.
you should take that, but you also have to understand who is giving you feedback from a place of trying to make you get better, and frankly, who is qualified to give you feedback, right? Because, for a long time, when I got out of the Army, I was going to this writers group at the local Barnes and Noble, and none of us had published anything, and we're all giving each other feedback. And with the best of intentions, but none of us had had any success yet. And so at some point you're like, okay, some of this maybe I should take and it's good, but some of it, if you knew how to do this, you'd be published too. And so, and that's kind of the conundrum of it, right? And so I would encourage everybody, like Greg is fantastic as a writer. He's one of the guys I aspire to be, but his reels on the topic of writing are pretty phenomenal too.
And there's a lot of great programs out there that people can get involved with. ITW has a lot of, was it Mastercraft and Craft Fest you can get involved with.
Yep.
There's other little programs out there that you can pay to get into, listen to guys like you, give some advice on how to start off, how to structure yourself. And I think investing in yourself is important when you're trying to do this, because a lot of people think, oh, it's easy to write a book and write a story. It's easy to write a story. You have to structure it, and that's something big I've learned. You have to structure it so that an agent looks at it and goes, okay, I can work with this and I can sell it, because it could be a fantastic story, but if it's written like crap, it's still crap.
No, that's true. And I think there's I several times realized that my toolkit wasn't where it needed to be yet. And so when I got serious about writing my first book in 2001, I took several classes from Writer's Digest online that were like the structure of a novel, the structure of a short story, how to write a scene, how to write dialogue, because a lot of writers lack very basic, even, how do you grammatically, how do you do dialogue, how do you tag dialogue, how do you, and things like that. And then after my second book didn't sell, I took the GI Bill and went back and got the MFA for the same reason. I think there's still some things that are missing. And Craft Fest at Thriller Fest is great for that. There's a bunch of writers that Kathy Antrim and has brought together for a school called Outliers University that, again, has a ton of good content and stuff. But you have to realize that if you're not succeeding, perseverance on its own or for its own sake is probably not going to be the solution to your problem. If you are trying to play basketball and you don't know how to shoot a free throw and you practice the wrong way every day for hours at end, you're still not going to get any better at shooting that free throw. You need to have a coach that comes in and says, whatever, your feet aren't in the right position. You're not, somebody needs to teach you the right way to practice, because practicing for practice sake does not equate to success.
That's good. Before I let you go, let's talk a little bit more Mitch Rapp. This Mitch Rapp is, when people get it, I'm not going to try not to spoil anything, but when people get it in their hands, this is a younger Mitch Rapp. Obviously, it's a flashback. It's a little more action-packed than some of the last couple. Not taking anything away from Kyle, but there's an age difference there. But what do you have to say to the Mitch Rapp fan base about what the future is going to look like in Don Bentley's hands?
Yeah, so what I would say is I'm a kid of the 80s, and one of my favorite movies was Top Gun. And so when Top Gun Maverick, when they were announcing it, I was very, very anxious about it, because there were so many things that I loved about Top Gun. And I thought, I don't even know if I want to watch this movie, because I'm afraid they're going to ruin it, right? Yeah. And so to their credit, I thought Top Gun Maverick was fantastic. It was an homage to all the little inside things we as fans loved about that movie. while still taking the story in new directions with new characters. And so that's kind of my philosophy for the Mitch Rapp universe is I was a fan first, and I'll be a fan afterwards when my time writing in this series is done. And so I don't want to do anything or won't do anything that will mess up your love affair with the original books and with the books Kyle's written. But I also want to take the series in new directions. And so I'm going to try and balance those things, and we'll see how it goes.
So I know you're getting ready to go on the book tour. You'll be busy with that, and then I'm sure some well-deserved time off, kind of enjoy and let this soak in. What's Don Bentley working on next when the book tour wraps up and you kind of take a breather?
Yeah, I'm working on the next Mitch Rapp book right now, and so I'll still be working on that during book tour and stuff. Not as many words, but we'll try and again for that same reason, not just that I'm a glutton for punishment, but because when you're in the drafting phase, at least for me, if you write more organically, kind of the seat of your pants, it's kind of like I love watching reels, the survival reels where guys show you how to make fires and build stuff. And,
Yeah.
every single one of them, right, when they get the tinder together, it's this really tiny spark that they have to feed very slowly in order to get that into a fire. And for me, writing the first draft is very much like that. And if I take a lot of time off or I don't at least try and write something in it, it's really, really easy for that spark to go out.
Well, Don, I wish you the best of luck on this release. The book tour sounds like it's going to be a blast, so people should definitely follow along to your social media so they can see how that's going. I believe you'll be able to watch the live event on Poison Pin and maybe some other ones. So that's cool. Before I let you go, tell people where they could find more about you, Vince Flynn, and the whole series.
Sure. So you can find everything at my website. It's just donbentley.books.com, Bentley. If you go to the news and events section, there's a list of the entire book tour, how to get tickets, how to get signed or personalized copies. You can also sign up for my newsletter when you're there. If you're a social media person, I'm on X, Instagram, and Facebook, and my handle is the same for all three of those. It's just at Bentley Don B. So BentleyDonB.